See, if you're only thinking about pro-life, you thought, dang, we just lost this referendum. Well, I guess that's done. No, 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 no. If you're pro-abundant life, you realize that even if abortion is legal, it can be unthinkable. The way forward has always been the way that's always been forward, which is through the church.
Hi again, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of The Narrative. Mike Andrews, David Mahan joining you today. David, it is good to see you again, my friend.
Yeah.
You have been so busy over at the State House. You haven't been with us in a couple of weeks.
I thought you would have replaced me or something by now. But,
well,
I missed you guys.
There was a petition.
Well, I miss Sam, actually.
That's fair.
Hi, Sam.
I mean, our producer is the only one who's liked among the staff here.
And she says I have a fan club. Don't I, Sam?
Yes, sir.
Well, fan club is an exaggeration.
She said fan club, so to all the Mahaniacs out there.
I don't even know if it's a fan quorum.
Peace, love,
to
and
be
hair
like, I
grease.
don't know if you could even take a vote with the number of people. Anyway, speaking of votes, some stuff going on across the street. Senate budget is the big news. I know you've been working hard on that, and we have a draft of the Senate budget as of yesterday, I believe?
Yeah, we were sitting in committee and, texting everybody on committee like we do, just trying to get all the dirt. And that thing dropped, and we ran back to the office as soon as possible. Just started finding out what got in from the House, what new from the Senate got in. And so we really we're really in a good place. Not everything we wanted is in there. Some of the good stuff that got in on the House side got stripped out. On the Senate side, that they don't like earmarks. They don't. There was too much policy in there, and then they put their own earmarks and policy in.
Of course, because that's what you do.
Right. And so, and that's not completely done. There's another crack at it on the Senate side to put some things in. One thing that did not get in, which we're extremely happy about, is the iGambling piece.
Yeah, we've been talking about that for a couple of weeks now.
Yeah, we were very, very concerned. Actually, many of the senators that I told, hey, that didn't make it in, they were like, what? Like, we heard it was going in. So I don't know what happened. I would just have to attribute that to, so many of the body of Christ that actually jumped on and got engaged, or answered our alerts. If you've not seen our webinar on iGaming and what that is, you have to watch that. Everybody, Mike, says the same thing when I bring up iGambling. Is I didn't know that. On Facebook today, a friend of mine from out of state, he said, man, I didn't even realize that. The one time he was actually suicidal in his life was when he had a gambling addiction. And he just found out that, gambling addicts have a 15 times, suicide rate than the general population. And so folks and even the spouses of the person who's struggling with gambling, their suicide rate is doubled. So a lot of the members, just like us, right, don't really know the ramifications of, opening the floodgates to another addiction for profit industry that only profits when we lose.
And we've got an entire webpage on ccv.org. If you go there, it's one of the first stories that you'll see on our carousel. It's at the top. It'll show you all the resources, including that webinar that we did. We've also, I think, got your testimony on there, David, and you and Monty the other day when you testified on bill versions of the iGaming expansion that are going through the House and the Senate. It's so fascinating to watch those because you sit through all of these lobbyists for the casino industry or for the iGaming. You can
see them in the background sweating.
It just seems like it's a big love-in, and then you and Monty get up there and say the quiet part out loud, the thing that nobody wants you to know or talk about, and it's palpable how powerful it is.
And I think it's good for everybody to understand, Mike, is that there's two things in play here. You've got the budget amendment stuff, right? And so we've got a 2-year General Assembly, so it could basically take 2 years of legislative process to get a bill passed. Well, here in the first year of the General Assembly, we've got 6 months of the budget cycle, right? So we can condense 2 years of legislation into 6 months. And so you could have literally, like we do with the gambling, we've got a Senate version, standalone bill. We've got a House version, standalone bill. But then we also have the budget move. And hopefully we killed the budget move. And I think the industry knows if they can't get it in the budget, they know we're going to kill it.
Yeah, and the budget stuff came up really quickly, which is why we responded the way that we did, and why
this
we've
was
been
not on our plate.
Right, we've been hammering it so hard over the last few weeks because we got to keep it out of the budget. And just because we're sharing with you this news today that it's not in the budget as of now, folks, we still need your voice on this. We still need you sending action alerts because budget process isn't done.
Yeah.
They could still get it in over the next couple of weeks. And the fact that we've got these standalone bills, you've got to let your lawmakers know that you don't want to see iGaming expanded in the state.
That's right. And lastly on that, you need to encourage your members in the Senate and the House, because 90% of them will say, I oppose gambling. But it was difficult to find even, a handful to say, if that thing gets in the budget, I'm not voting for the budget. So, basically because there's $60 billion worth of stuff in that budget, right? And they feel like, I might have to vote for iGambling, to get this other budget stuff done. And so they need you to encourage them about how serious this is, because pretty much everybody out there knows somebody with a gambling problem and how it impacts not just that one, but up to 6 people outside of that one person.
What are some other things that you saw in the Senate budget that you were excited about, or that we've talked about as legislation that we're tracking or pushing?
Yeah, I'm glad to see the marijuana reporting stayed in, and that's important, right? We don't like this marijuana stuff, but the only way we're going to get good policy is to get good reporting, so we can see what the real story is about high potency THC in the state of Ohio, beyond what the industry folks tell us, right? That's in there. We got success sequence right in there. Kid just graduates high school, works a full-time job, gets married before having children. 97% of the time, they will avoid poverty. I think everybody needs to know that. And that's in the budget. Cell phone ban, right? Kids are going to hate me for this. So I probably lost half my fan club over that, right? Because I think they're all under 20.
Quorum. Fan quorum.
But we got to get these phones out of the classroom. Unfortunately, I think it only deals with the actual phone. So we probably just blew up, the iWatch stock and Google Glass.
Smart wearables, yeah.
And then LifeWise, the LifeWise fix is still in there, which basically sets a minimum amount of time that schools must allow release time religious instruction during the year. So
those are all things that we're tracking, folks. And by all means, once the process is done, because now it goes to what's called conference committee, correct? And they reconcile the differences between the House version and the Senate version. Yeah,
the Senate version. So what we saw yesterday was the Senate Finance Committee's, first crack at it. The Senate still has time to play a little bit, and then they'll vote on the floor. Then it goes to conference committee, where the House and the Senate basically have to find something that works for both of them before it goes to the governor's office.
Yep. Then it goes to the governor, and he has line item veto power in that. That's right. He can take stuff out he doesn't like, which is another reason to stay on top of our iGaming action alert. And then once it's all said and done and passed, we'll sit down and we'll unpack it, and we'll walk you through some of the major policy wins and other things that we know will be in effect or coming into effect because of that. That'll be coming up at the end of the month. So
there's over 1,200 bills in play right now, just in the budget cycle.
Well, are you just sleeping at the State House, or
what? We get no sleep.
It looks like it. I don't mean to be too pointed, but
true.
Looking a little rough, my friend.
I can't wait till we do the video. It's gonna be great.
It's coming. Yeah. Okay. Spoiler alert. There is going to be video of the Narrative podcast coming soon. Can't say exactly when, but we've got some stuff up our sleeves.
They're going to give me a wardrobe allowance from Meyer.
Whoa.
And we're going to get some good
Meyer,
gear.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
We'll have your quorum meet you there so they can pick out your kicks.
Coming to you soon.
Yeah. Well, today on the podcast with our guest interview, we're going to talk to Roland Warren, the president and CEO of CareNet. He's got a new book out called The Alternative to Abortion. And when he unpacks the biblical framework for what he's proposing as the way for the pro-life movement to go forward, it's powerful, and really enjoyed the conversation with Roland, and I know you're going to be blessed by it, and we're excited to bring it to you coming up next on The Narrative. Hey, Narrative listeners. Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian Chamber of Commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org. And we're back on The Narrative. Mike Andrews and David Mahan, joined now by Roland Warren, who's the president and CEO of CareNet. He's a published author and the former president of the National Fatherhood Initiative. Roland has made national media appearances sharing his story and his work, and he and his wife, Yvette, have 2 married sons and 4 grandchildren. And we're so pleased to have you on the Narrative podcast today. Thanks for joining us.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I wanted to talk with you today. I saw your new book, the title of your new book, The Alternative to Abortion. And as I mentioned before we came on the air, it ties in to our Hope in a Future report that deals with marriage and family. And I think there's this great overlap between how marriage and fatherhood impact abortion statistics. And after reading some of your book, some of the early chapters, I am just so impressed by how pastoral and practical it is and biblically grounded it is. I think this is a great resource for the pro-life movement, and just wanted to say thank you for writing it.
Oh, praise God. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Well, make sure you go to Amazon and say that.
Exactly.
Shameless promotion. There you go.
Well, hey, that if you write a book, you expect to get some sales from it, right?
Oh, that'd be great. No, actually, it really helps the ministry. So I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
If we could start on your subtitle, though, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life. Can we start there and just unpack what you mean by pro-abundant life?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the main things, certainly the insight that God gave me is, when people say to me that they're pro-life, I've got a habit now of saying, like, what do you mean by that? Because the term pro-life, it's on a spectrum. So let me give you an example. Someone says, well, listen, I'm pro-life. Why? Okay, because I believe, in Imago Dei, right, that children in the womb are created in the image of God. And so to destroy the image of God, I mean, that's horrible sin. I mean, it violates, love of God, if you will, which is embedded in the Great Commandment. And I believe that the circumstances of a child's conception and birth should not determine is humanity and worth. So whether you're conceived in love or planned or unplanned, or whether you have some fetal abnormality, whatever it may be, your humanity is intact because it's directly connected to you being created in the image of God. So that's a pro-life person. Another person said, I'm pro-life too. Well, tell me about it. Well, I'm pro-life, but I'm for a 15-week ban. So after 15 weeks, then I wouldn't want abortions. But before 15 weeks, so I'm pro-life too. And that's a political position that you've seen out in the public square communicated. But 96% of abortions happen before 15 weeks. So you're okay with 96% of abortions? Absolutely, but I'm pro-life. Okay. What about you? Well, I'm pro-life and pain capable. So late-term abortions after 20 weeks, I just find that problematic. And when a baby can feel pain, then certainly we shouldn't be able to abort the baby. And you're pro-life too? Yes, I'm pro-life too. And you see the problem. Mm-hmm. What is an absolute issue is now on a spectrum. It's not an absolute anymore. It's on a spectrum. And the problem is that life can't be on a spectrum. You're not like partially alive, right? You're either dead or alive. And as I kind of unpacked that and thought about it, I said, well, why is that? And a lot of that is because, the pro-life movement gave the issue to the politics to solve. So we decided, I really believe that we're going to solve this issue through a political power and also material support, that kind of political and material framework, which we can talk about a bit more. But when you think about the political process, the very nature of the political process is to basically two folks come together that have convictions. I got a conviction around tax policy. You got a conviction around policy, or whether you're environmentalists or whatever. Like, people come together and they both have convictions. And then the political compromise is basically about abandoning some aspect of your conviction, right? Mm-hmm. So the nature of politics is to take a conviction and then abandon it in some way, shape, or form in order to reach a compromise. That's great for lots of different things, where I could say, well, I could take this road this way versus that way, or maybe you don't trip down that many trees, or maybe you can compromise on that. But when it comes to the life issue, you can see the problem that we have. Like, we're stuck in sort of this Solomon's dilemma. You can't split the baby, if you will, because either you have life or don't have life. So that was kind of the framework that God had given me over the years as I thought about this. And the problem with that, I said, well, then we have to take the lead of this issue from the political narrative. Essentially, I talk about that as the podium, and we need to take it and put it back in the pulpit. Mm-hmm. See, because the pulpit's supposed to have a perspective that's not flexible that way. In other words, the podium, anybody can say anything from a podium. That's why when the president speaks, they put a seal in front of the president, right? The presidential seal, he speaks, and when he leaves, they take the seal. Because the podium in and of itself has no gravitas. It has no intrinsic perspective. But the pulpit, now that's different. That pulpit is supposed to be connected to Jesus' why and why Jesus came. Well, why did Jesus come? That we might have life and have that life abundantly. In other words, John 10:10. So that led me there. And I said, well, gosh, we can't be pro-life, if you will, because that's a political narrative, right? There's some good aspects of it, don't get me wrong. But we have to be pro-abundant life because Jesus was pro-abundant life. When he said, I came that you might have life and then have that life abundantly, what Jesus was talking about was not just physical life, but also spiritual life. Bios, B-I-O-S, where we get the word biology, and then also Zoe, which is a unique type of spiritual life that only comes from a relationship with God. So essentially what Jesus was saying, I came to link your Bios to my Zoe that you might be heartbeats that are heaven-bound. And so you can see that narrative is not a narrative from the podium. That's a narrative from the pulpit. That's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so as a Christian, my challenge to other Christians is, listen, we can't be pro-life. God calls us, Christ calls us to more than that, because Jesus wasn't just pro-life, he was pro-abundant life. And if you believe that life begins at conception till natural death, that means that abundant life that exists outside the womb is what Christ wants folks to have inside the womb, linking Bios and Zoe, thus being pro-abundant life. And that's really the subtitle of the book and kind of the framework that I lay out in the book. It's like how you get there practically, theologically, and biblically, and then what do you do once you're there?
And I'm going to oversimplify it here, I know, but essentially the two main pillars of the solution are family and church, correct?
That's all. That's because, see, if you look at it, I mean, I have a graphic in there, which you may have seen if you look at the book, but I have this graphic where it's like a house with a roof, and the roof is the pro-abundant life roof, John 10:10. And then to hold up that roof, there are two pillars. The first pillar is God's design for family. God's design for family. And the second pillar is God's call to discipleship. And the beautiful thing about this is that both of these perspectives are in the first chapter, are in the first book of the Bible, of the New Testament, if you will. The first chapter, the first book of the New Testament talks about God's design for family. And it really, and the thing that's so beautiful about it, it starts with an unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective, the birth of Christ. Most celebrated unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective. And as I read that, I said, my gosh, what did God do when there was an unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective? I mean, what happened with Mary? I mean, she faced an unplanned pregnancy. She had hopes for her life, dreams for her life that did not include a child at that time and in that way. And what did God do? He went to her, gave her the news that you basically conceive and bear a child. She said, let it be unto me as you have said, and chose life. In other words, a woman facing a pregnancy decision, we're trying to encourage her to tap into her inner Mary, to ascribe to herself the virtue and the character of Mary. But what did God do to make sure that Mary's unplanned pregnancy wasn't a crisis pregnancy? He didn't give her a baby daddy and a check. A check and a social worker, right? Not even the Message version of the Bible. He gave her a husband. He called Joseph to be a husband to her and a father to the child growing inside of her. And then when Mary was at risk, who did the angel go to? Joseph again, to provide and to protect. One man, two missions, husband to her, father to the child growing inside of her. One man, two missions, to provide and to protect. And so as I looked at that biblical narrative of the most celebrated unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective, and I looked at that through the lens of what's happening in the pro-life movement, what I realized is that it's not what we're doing. We're generally not doing that. A lot of folks close the Bible and say, gosh, we got to help the proverbial Marys and save the proverbial Jesuses. But that's not what God did. He created a family. And when you look at the data, just practically, 87% of the women that have abortions are unmarried. So what you see in the first chapter, in the first book of the New Testament, is not just the sanctity of life, but the sanctity of marriage and family as God designed. And we delink those things in our response to abortion. And God, look, if there was anybody who was equipped to walk this earth without an earthly father, clearly Jesus was. No question about it, right? But God made a point that he wanted to bring the Savior into the world consistent with his design for family. So he found this perfect construct. Mary and Joseph were married. They were in a covenant relationship that had not been consummated. And Jesus comes into that construct that accomplishes God's purpose to bring a Savior into the world without violating his principle, his design for family. So Jesus was given abundant life in his humanity and then became abundant life for us all. And so as Christians, again, that's linked back to John 10:10. Like, so you can be an atheist and be pro-life, but you can't be an atheist and be pro-abundant life. So that frankly is just the framework of that first pillar that really inspired me. And as I looked through the lens of that, it really helped me a lot. And again, we can talk a little about that, but my own personal story kind of informed that a lot as well.
And you had some interesting connections on the fatherhood piece too, especially when it comes to a woman's decision to choose life or choose abortion. So just the presence of a father in your work, talk about how much of a difference that makes.
Yeah, look, I'll start with just a personal story. When I was a 20-year-old college student, I was an undergrad at Princeton. I was a junior, and my girlfriend was a sophomore. Now my wife, Yvette, 43 years as of a couple of days ago. But we faced an unplanned pregnancy. We got pregnant. We were Christians doing stuff a Christian ain't supposed to be doing. We got pregnant. The consequences of it. And when she went to Student Health Services, the nurse came out, delivered the test, went back, came back with the results and says the test is positive, and without taking an extra gulp of air said, now of course you're going to have an abortion. And Yvette says, well, I don't want to have an abortion. I want to have my baby. I want to get married. The nurse says, what year are you? Oh, you're a sophomore. How are you going to graduate from Princeton with a baby? And then what do you want to do when you graduate? Oh, you want to become a doctor. My gosh, how are you going to become a doctor with a baby? And, Yvette says, well, I want to get married. I want to do that. In any case, she comes back to the dorm room, I imagine, and we have a discussion. And I say, no, we're going to move forward with the plan. She says, we're going to move forward with the plan. And that's what we did. We got married. I was 20. She was 19. We got married by the Justice of the Peace. And we had our first and second son at Princeton. She ended up graduating, becoming a doctor. She's been practicing medicine almost 30 years now. Now, here's the thing about this, right? For the first 5 months of her pregnancy, there was one guy who knew she was pregnant, other than, anybody. Like, nobody knew except me. You think I had an influence? You think I had a role? You think I could have influenced the decision of that? So that was my life story as a 20-year-old. And then when I started looking at the data, we did like national surveys of men who had abortions and women who participated in abortions or all that. And what we found was when we talked to women who had abortions and we asked them, who did they talk to? Who was the most influential? Number one was the guy. Then we asked the guys who participated, who did she talk to? Who was the most influential? He said, I was. So both the women who have abortions and the men who support it are both saying he's the most influential in the decision to abort. Okay. So again, look at what the movement's doing, right? How we framed the movement for almost 50 years, right? About either saving the baby or love them both, the woman and the baby. But it's, when you look at the biblical narrative, it's love them all. God's creating a family. So you don't get a family in God's design without men. And so essentially my wife was called to ascribe to herself the virtue and the character of Mary, right? And I was called to ascribe to myself the virtue and the character of Joseph. And that's the model. That's the model which you see in the first chapter, the first book of the New Testament. And that's why I'm so passionate about it. Not because it's, quote, my idea or Karen's idea, but it's God's idea. And he put that there in the first chapter of the first book of the New Testament for such a time as this, and we lost that narrative. So it's the sanctity of marriage and family consistent with God's design, then the sanctity of life. And by the way, there's an order there, because the first thing Joseph was told was, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, even before he was told who Jesus was. So the sanctity of marriage and family came before the sanctity of life. The basket to protect the child was there before the child was born. Do you see? So my call is being pro-abundant life. That's what we're doing. As Christians, we have a very unique perspective in terms of how we should be leading on this issue.
That's good. And what role do you see the church playing in this specifically?
Yeah, well, it's the second pillar, God's call to discipleship. Often, like when you talk to people who are Christians and they're pro-life, and they say they're pro-life, and you ask them to prove it, they tell you who they voted for. Now, don't get me wrong. There's a political component and a material support piece. But the life issue is not primarily political. It's primarily an issue of a good work that should lead to discipleship. That's a key piece, right? So Jesus, if you're following Jesus's model, he had people coming to him with all of these bios situations, right? Water for the thirsty, food for the hungry. This person needs a physical healing. This one has too much blood. This one has too much money. This one has too much pride. This one has too many demons. Like, all these people would come to Jesus with a bios kind of issue. And what did he do? He'd meet them at their point of bios and then call them into a Zoe relationship with him. So if you're pro-life, I'm going to say, but then you send them back to the community that brought them to you in the first place. That's transactional, not transformational. The only way you get that transformation And God's design is that you connect them to the discipleship making aspect, that second pillar, which is the call of the church. So it's God's design for family, yes, but then that family that's created is supposed to be connected to the church to be disciples who make disciples who live and love like Jesus. And so that means that the role of the church is critical, central to a pro-abundant life perspective. And just frankly, practically, if you don't do that, let's say a woman comes to a pregnancy center, Kieran has 1,200 plus of them. She comes to the pregnancy center, you love her up, she decides to have the child, you send her back to the community that's dealing with fatherhood, motherhood, sex, and marriage, and God's design for those things. What do you think happens too often? She'll be back. Mm-hmm. Second pregnancy, second dude. That's not ministry. That's business. That's thank you, come again. Jesus met the woman at the well one time. And her issue, by the way, was her no husband problem. The reason that she was at the well all alone, the hottest part of the day, was tied to her no husband problem. Why do you think somebody's sitting at Planned Parenthood? Why do you think they're sitting at a pregnancy center? It's typically their no husband problem. And what did Jesus do? He went right there and affirmed the sanctity of his design for family, of marriage and family, right? And then what happened? She was transformed, and I'm confident the next day she needed to go to the well, she wasn't all alone. Why? Because he restored her physically, emotionally, spiritually, and socially. That's the role of a Christian call. So that spiritual and social connection piece that happens in the church is designed so that she doesn't go back, if you will, right? Kind of revisit the vomit, if you will, that she becomes a new creation that now is making disciples, first of the child growing inside of her, herself, and then also the guy that got her pregnant. So the role of the church is God's call to discipleship. And so we should be viewing the life issue primarily through the lens of discipleship as an opportunity for us to make a disciple of Jesus Christ.
Yeah, and just personally, Roland, I want to say thank you just for all of your advocacy over the years. Again, I know you lead one of the largest networks of pregnancy centers in the country and really the world. And just doing a phenomenal job. I've been to several of your conferences. Also, I thank you for this platform, right? I think it's a great context for us to put both the work that needs to be done, with Pro-Abundant Life, and also the work that needs to be done in the church and discipleship. But kind of putting a focus on Ohio. And I know several months ago I shared some of this with you, but we did have our issue one, right? We had we were in the crosshairs of the abortion industry, and they won 57 to 53 here in the state of Ohio. We did some polling to see kind of what was to diagnose what happened, right? Because you had, like you said, the political world, right? You had the left, thankfully, being thankful over the win. Then you had the right blaming the left, and it was that commercial, the lies of the media. But what we found was there was a third of weekly attending believers that actually voted. And voting is important. It's a responsibility for us here in our country, but it is not the end all for sure, right? However, it is a benefit that we have here in our country. But we blamed it on the loss of that. We blame that on the left when a third of us just voted the wrong way and a third of us didn't show up to vote at all. So looking at this again, I love the framework, but being where we are and you leading one of the largest networks of pregnancy centers, what do you tell them to do, right? Because I feel like a lot of the pregnancy centers came out of the church, parachurch, because the church was not doing anything, and you say because they abdicated their responsibility to the political realm. But you've got a lot of these, we've got 150 of them here. Do they, if the woman is not willing to involve the husband, if the husband or the father of the baby, if the father of the baby is not willing to help the mother, what do we practically tell them? Do we not serve that woman at all because, there's no discipleship piece necessarily? There's no connection. What do we do practically?
Yeah. No, it's a really interesting point and a good point. And you make the point on the political piece. Unfortunately, these referendums that have failed, I'm saddened but not surprised. And the reason I say that, and I'll get to more specifically your point, but because when I first started doing this work about 13 years ago, one of the first things I did, I was new to the movement. Like my grandmother didn't take me to pro-life marches or any of that. I had my own experience in college, but I wasn't, quote, in the movement. So I just started trying to understand what the issue was. And I looked at Guttmacher data, and it showed at the time that 65% of the women that had abortions professed to be either Catholic or Protestant. And I started talking to people and saying, this is a problem. I said, because if the argument is we're going to overturn Roe and send it back to the states, and if we lost the people in the pews, then we're going to lose them at the polls. So we need to be focused on first getting the pew right before we're going to think we're going to get the polls right. But there wasn't a focus there, right? We just kept focusing on the polls without focusing on the pews. So now you see these referendums, both here, Florida, all of them. The margin of difference is Christians. The margin of difference is Christians.
That's right.
Who are voting, who are basically pro-choice Christians. Well, why is that? See, it has a lot to do with, and this actually leads to like the response for someone facing a pregnancy decision, your practical response. But the other piece that God gave me in terms of pro-abundant life perspective is that you have to view the life issue through the two great pillars of the church, like of the Christian church, these two bookends. It's the Great Commandment and the Great Commission. I mean, all Jesus did was walk along, living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission. That's all he did. Ultimately on the cross, living out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission, right? So here's the point. If the church can't find, if we can't find the life issue, the abortion issue in the Great Commandment or the Great Commission, then it's something that's outside the church, where the church doesn't lead, the church follows. Like it's like backpacks for school kids. I mean, that's a good thing to do, but it ain't the gospel in that context. And I believe the why behind like Christians not being motivated about this is twofold. One, we've been plugged into the politics for so long. It's almost like the movie The Matrix. You got to be unplugged. So you start to see clearly and you realize, oh my gosh, we ain't got the cool sunglasses and the great black suits and the this and the leather. We raggedy, right? We're raggedy. And once you see that, you say, okay, now what do I need to do? Well, the first thing is you got to start viewing the life issue through the lens of the Great Commandment. Well, what is the Great Commandment? To love God, to love your neighbor, right? To love God with all your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength, and your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. 3 loves, right? Within that, love of God, love of neighbor, and love of self. And I love Luke 10:27 because a lawyer comes to Jesus and says, what must I do to inherit the kingdom of God, right? And all the life issues, all about lawyers. And what does Jesus say? Oh, he says, well, what's the book say? And the lawyer rightly says what I just said. And then Jesus is like, you got it right. And then the lawyer has a very central question, which is the question that happens on the ballot. If you don't answer that question right, he says, who's my neighbor?
Who's my neighbor? Mm-hmm.
Who's my neighbor? Now, the problem is here, right? We don't stop before we got to the who's my neighbor question. Because if you just have the law and you haven't figured out who's your neighbor, and you aren't framing it through that lens, then you're going to have a problem in terms of what you do next, right? Because this issue is about neighbors. This is where Big Bird and Mr. Rogers meet. Big Bird and his crew running around saying, well, who are the people in my neighborhood, right? So if you run into the poll and you don't even know who your neighborhoods are, that's a problem. And the baby in the womb is saying, like Mr. Rogers, won't you be my neighbor? He get a little James Brown on you. He break it down. Like, won't you please, like you rip that cardigan, won't you please be my neighbor, right? So Jesus understands that. And what does Jesus do? He doesn't answer the question with an answer. He answers with a story. He tells the story of the Good Samaritan, right? And what do you have in that story? You have a neighbor who cannot advocate for themselves. And then you got church folks who know the law, but they built a neighborhood that does not include the vulnerable.
Wanting to justify themselves. Yeah.
You see what I'm saying? And so let's say those folks are heading to the polls. They're heading to the polls. They know the law, but they haven't defined the neighbor. And they go to the other side and they pull the other lever. And then who goes near to the neighbor? And that's the thing where you find this perspective in the Great Commandment. Why? Because when you look at that passage, the word for neighbor means near one or near fellow. We talk about nearness in terms of proximity, next to you, or relationship next to kin. The baby in the woman's womb is her nearest near one. The same for the guy who got her pregnant. So you realize, see, if you're the priest and the Levite, see, you gotta take your advocacy and turn it into care. And you don't do that just by understanding like the law. You got to understand how to apply the law in every area of your life. And they did not. They created a neighborhood that didn't include the vulnerable. And that's what happened in Ohio on every one of these ballot initiatives. You had Christian people who knew the law, but didn't know the neighbor. They didn't apply it. So what happens? The Good Samaritan, what he goes near to the near one. Then Jesus says, who was the neighbor to the man who fell? Says the one who showed them mercy, right? And the Hebrew word, the root word for that word mercy, if you will, has the same root as the word for compassion, the word for womb. In other words, who put the man in the womb? Because a womb is supposed to be a place of compassion. Now, you walk into the polls with that perspective, you're going to vote very, very differently than just the person who just knows the law but doesn't know the neighbor. Now, who has that narrative? The podium doesn't have that narrative.
That's right. Mm.
Only the pulpit has that narrative. So you see that abortion is a violation of the Great Commandment. So if you call yourself a progressive Christian or this Christian or red letter Christian, I don't care what you call yourself. Nobody gets a pass on the Great Commandment. These are from the words of Jesus and the life of Jesus. And abortion is also a violation of what? The Great Commission. Why? Because your first discipleship community that you have is the children that God gives you. They're your neighbors. And then abortion is a violation of that. Why? Because killing one of your neighbors or assisting someone in killing one of their neighbors is not an act of discipleship. So if you're a Christian and you're trying to live out the Great Commandment to fulfill the Great Commission, you won't vote for abortion. But if we haven't been sitting in the churches and the pews teaching it this way, if we've been teaching it versus Republican and Democrat politics, as opposed to teaching in that context, the person, again, they cross to the other side of the road. They pull the other lever. So the way forward is what the way has always been, which has been first, we got to get the church right on this issue in terms of word and deed before we're ever going to be able to get the politics right. Because if you lose the polls, you lose the pews, you lose the polls. And if you lose the pastors, you lose the pews. So first you got to have the pastors right, so the pews are right. And you get the pews right, then you get the polls right. Right? So, in terms of that framework that you're talking about, it's one of the reasons why we developed a resource at CareNet called Making Life Disciples. And the goal of that resource is to get people in the church, small groups in the church. So many Christians were part of small groups. And our small groups a lot of times are about us loving us. What if our small groups were about us loving them? What if your small group was trained so that someone in your church who's facing a pregnancy decision, part of that 65, now 54% who profess to be the Catholic or Protestant, there's a ministry in the church to offer compassion, hope, and help him and her live out the discipleship of Jesus Christ in the context of this unplanned pregnancy from a human perspective. What if you had a ministry there? And for someone outside of the church that's at a pregnancy center or in a community, to bring them into the church to offer them compassion, hope, and discipleship. And here's the point. Even if they choose abortion, we're still called to love them. Why? Because Peter aborted Jesus. Abortion is a rejection of vulnerable life for some other agenda. That's what Peter did. What did Jesus do? I'm done with him. No, he restored him. Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me? And Peter then became one of the most powerful advocates for Christ. Someone who's had the abortion decision made that abortion decision. Many of them are sitting in pews of our churches. Like Peter, going back to fishing, think that they cannot engage here. So I can't pull the lever against abortion because I did it. So if you even help that person become forgiven and set free, then their politics are going to be connected to how they're thinking about this issue. You see what I'm saying? So this work is work first in the church. And that's really like the call that God's put on my heart. We all trying to get the culture right and all this stuff. First, we got to get the church right. I'm a black man. I'm like this all day. I tell people, I said, imagine it's 1860 and you got the abolition, they're getting together and they're like, look, we're going to stop the slavery in the South. And so we're going to do a quick thing. Zeke, we need to do a quick survey, just how many of us have slaves. Because I'm just going to do it just to see. And they do the survey and it comes back to 65% of them own slaves. Oh, 60, well, let's get the South. Somebody should prize it. Well, shouldn't we Jesus made it clear, get the log out of our own eyes so we can see more clearly, get the speck out of the culture's eye? So that's what starts, but in terms of word and deed. So you understand the law, which is what happens in the Great Commandment. They understood the law, word and deed, but they didn't understand the neighborhood. So now we're offering love, compassion, hope, and help from folks. And what has always transformed the culture from a Christian perspective is, how they love them. How they love them. Not, how they vote. And here's the point that I always make, because people get it twisted. Oh, it's around you saying we're not supposed to vote. No, not at all. Here's the point, right? A pro-life perspective leads you to the polls. A pro-abundant life perspective leads you to the cross. So you go to the cross and then you go to the polls. So you take that biblical perspective into the booth with you. What we've been doing is going to the polls and then going to the cross. So we're taking a political perspective to the church. And that's how you get a 15-week ban and all these other things, because that's what the polls are telling us. So I would just encourage folks that are listening, check out makinglifedisciples.com, small groups in churches, coming alongside women and men facing pregnancy decisions, helping them see this pro-abundant life perspective, helping her look. If a guy ain't there, to step into that role as a husband and a father, well, James 1:27 says what? Religion that is pure as fall is what? You care for the orphans and widows in their distress, right? What was an orphan when that was written? It was a child without a father, and what was a widow? It was typically a mother without a husband. So that means the church is a very specific call to these cultural orphans and widows, right? Because the husband and father, proverbial husband and father, is saying, "You're dead to me." To love them and show them compassion. You start stringing that together, it changes what happens in the culture, because the church is being the body of Christ and leading with love, and then that changes what happens with the politics.
Excellent.
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a good word, because I think we've seen around issue 1 and our Hope in a Future report that the places that churches are willing to engage are on issues of discipleship and evangelism. And when it has a positive impact on life and family, that's like an added bonus. But you lead with the gospel and you let the gospel do its work and affect change in these other issues as well.
And this is why, see, even in Ohio, I'm hopeful. See, if you're only thinking about pro-life, you thought, dang, we just lost this referendum. Well, I guess that's done. No. If you're pro-abundant life, you realize that even if abortion is legal, it can be unthinkable. When I first started, people said, well, when's Roe going to be overturned? I said, don't get it twisted. Roe is overturned every single day. My wife overturned Roe v. Wade. It was perfectly legal back in 1982 for her to have an abortion, and she rejected it. Why? She had a guy say, I'll be a husband to you and a father to the child growing inside of you. And she understood God's call to discipleship. Those two things together made abortion unthinkable for her, even though it was legal. So the way forward has always been the way that's always been forward, which is through the church. And here's the other thing, too, in terms of engaging pastors, right? I had a group of pro-life pastors I was talking to out in Texas, very pro-life, very pro-life. And I said to them, I said, how many became pastors because you wanted to overturn Roe v. Wade? Nobody raised their hand. I said, how many became pastors because you wanted to end abortion in your lifetime? No hands. Then I said, how many of you became pastors because you felt called to preach the gospel of Jesus Christ and to make disciples for Jesus Christ? Every hand shot up. What does that tell you? If a pastor does not see the life issue primarily through the call of the church, then it's something that they care about, but it's not the core mission of the church. Mary faced an unplanned pregnancy to what end? That she might be a disciple of Jesus Christ. God used an unplanned pregnancy in Mary's life to what end? That she might be a disciple of Jesus Christ. When you see a woman facing an unplanned pregnancy, what's your first thought? Is that your first thought? Or is I got to figure out I can vote so she can't abort or whatever? And so God used an unplanned pregnancy to lead to discipleship, for her to be a disciple of Jesus Christ and to have that abundant life. So when you see a woman that way, that's your first thought. Should be, no. That's a message of the church. That's a message of the pulpit, not the message of the podium. So I really believe firmly that as the church begins to reconnect this issue, like the other good works we do, water for the thirsty, food for the hungry, clothes for the naked, homes for the homeless, right? You never hear a pastor say, I can't preach about that because politicians are talking about it. I can't touch that. It's too political. Never hear it. Why? Because they see those issues as discipleship issues. And honestly, and I'm just being candid here, and this will get me in trouble. The pro-life movement did this to the church. We did it. The movement did it. The movement in the 80s said, we're going to win this with political power and material support through pregnancy centers and political engagement. That's what happened. That's the reality of it. So the church, which is supposed to lead, no longer leads. So I'll give you an illustration to make that point. Remember when Jesus was given that coin? Said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar, unto God what is God, right? What did Caesar care about? Political power and material wealth. The political and the material, right? And Jesus said there's a higher thing. So I'm making a triangle with my hand. The higher thing. What is the higher thing? Living out the great commandment to fulfill the great commission. So if you're living out the great commandment to fulfill the great commission, well, guess what you'll do? You'll help your brother and sister in need. And guess what else? You'll be politically engaged. Why? Because you're called to hold the government to be just and merciful to whom? Especially the vulnerable, right? So we said there's the higher thing and the lower thing. So by focusing on the higher thing, you don't lose the lower thing. By focusing on the lower thing, you lose the higher thing. So what did? We flipped it. We said we're going to win this with political power and material wealth, or material support. So the church, which is supposed to be the higher thing, became the lower thing. Then we're wondering why is the church not leading? We told the church, we got this. It's like David when he went and he's going to fight Goliath. And he went to Saul, and Saul said, I'll hook you up. I got the hook up. and David was like, no, I'm good. I'm good. I think we just, okay, give me the hookup. We went out there. Now we got pounded down by Goliath, and we going back. He's trying to give us a new sword. Jesus, God's up there with popcorn going like, when y'all ready to use what I gave you, you'll see the victory. Mm-hmm. So again, what I'm saying is actually not new. It's very, very old. It's in the first chapter of the first book of the New Testament. And the last chapter of the first book of the New Testament. God made it incredibly easy for us. Incredibly easy for us. But we're when we want to fight this battle with the weapons that God has given us for victory, then we can do that. And I'm not discouraged by that, because we always can change and say, you know what? No, pastors must lead. Pro-life movement as an entity must decrease, and the church must increase.
Yeah, that's a good word. That is a very succinct biblical theology for the life issue, and it's what I found so encouraging on the pages of the book, and I'm grateful that you jumped on here today to share it with our audience. I know you mentioned Amazon. Any other places they should be looking out for the new book, or is that the best place?
Yeah, on Amazon. Yeah, we've got a digital version, and we also have the hard copy version. But yeah, check it out. I encourage them also to go, again, makinglifedisciples.com as well. You go to CareNet. And also care-net.org to our website to learn more about what CareNet is doing. And I mean, I'm just talking about just a little bit of what we do. We have a robust post-abortion ministry, Forgiven and Set Free, which is one of the largest post-abortion ministries for women. And then we have Reclaiming Fatherhood for men who've been participating in abortion. I always tell people there are two unreached people groups in the life issue. One is men who've been sidelined and told to be sidelined, and the other is post-abortive folks. Those are two unreached people group. You start motivating and getting that moving, man, it totally transforms what happens on the life issue. You got people sitting in pews, as I said, don't feel that they're worthy to be engaged, but they have stories that they can talk to folks. So we've tried to think about this as a pre-abortion perspective. That's what Making Life Disciples is about, getting small groups in the church to come alongside someone facing a pregnancy decision, to offer them compassion, hope, and help, physical, emotional, spiritual, and social support, like Jesus did with the woman at the well. And then post-abortion is what we're talking about here for those who've made that decision, so we can press those folks into service to be disciples who make disciples, who live and love like Jesus, and let God use that story, the mistake that they made, in the same way that he's using the mistake that I made, having sex outside of wedlock, and all that we face as a result of that and the consequences of that. God uses that to what is for our good and for the glory of others. So we've got what we need. We have the weapons that we need. Even if the legislative stuff heads the other way, right? We've got a long strategy, which is helping people become disciples of Jesus Christ. And when that happens, guess what? It changes the way they vote. It changes how they engage. So again, the church leading on this is a critical for the success that God wants us to have on this issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, the book is The Alternative to Abortion, Why We Must Be Pro-Abundant Life. And Roland Warren, thank you so much for your time today and joining us on The Narrative.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Bear, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.